My name's Tim Burt. I'm the Master of Hatfield College, and I've got almost no role in tonight's proceedings other than to welcome you all here this evening and to say how very good it is to have inaugural lectures being hosted in colleges. This is the first that Hatfield's been able to host, but we're delighted to do so, and it's great to have Fiona here with us tonight.
Thank you, Tim. Well, my role is formally to preside or to chair this. I'm very pleased indeed. Indeed, it's a privilege for me to be able to do so, although, as you will see, I won't really have very much to do. The format for this, I understand, is that Fiona will simply give her paper, and there's no plan to have any questions and answers, although I dare say if she finishes a bit early, she might choose to do otherwise. As I said, I'm very pleased indeed to be able to welcome you for Fiona's inaugural lecture. She's been a splendid capture for us. We're extremely pleased to have her here. She's been an absolutely excellent colleague in every single way possible in relation to her research, her collegiality, her willingness to work, take on roles. She's been a great inspiration, I think, for everyone in the law school. And I'm just very, very pleased indeed that she's giving this paper. So I shall just simply pass it over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that really incredibly kind introduction, and indeed for the very warm welcome that you and the rest of my colleagues have given me to the law school and to this really wonderful university where I've enjoyed very much what I hope will be the first of many years. I also want to thank Professor Burt and Hatfield College for hosting us this evening, the Vice-Chancellor and the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research for supporting this series of inaugural lectures in the university and inviting me to give one, and of course to my friends, family and colleagues who have come here this evening. When I was invited back in November to give a lecture in this series, I followed a pattern of personal behaviour that those of you who know me well, and certainly my parents, will be entirely familiar with, which is I said yes straight away, and then I thought about it afterwards. And at least I suppose I had the good sense to pick the date of delivery that was the furthest away from the time I was asked, so that I could find out a little bit more about the inaugural tradition before I arrived here today. Of course, as is almost inevitably the case, the more I found out, the more daunting the task seemed to be, because depending on what one reads, inaugural lectures appear to be a mixture between an opportunity for your family to burst with pride and for your employer to experience a particularly acute form of buyer's remorse. Inaugurals are, of course, also an opportunity to speak about the thing that keeps one intellectually engaged from term to term and year to year. And in that respect, it is a tradition to try the patience and fortitude of your audience, largely made up of friends and family, by talking to them at length and in a situation they cannot easily escape from, about the same thing that you talk to them about over drinks and dinner, and for students who don't even have food or drink to anaesthetise them in class. And so, not to break with tradition, I intend to do precisely that. We might feel an acute form of sympathy for the one person, and there's always one person who has heard the lecture numerous times already and witnessed the tortuous task of writing it. In that case, in my case, that person is Orly, who was not only patient enough to listen to it, but also gracious enough to take my very ungracious reaction to her perfectly well made and entirely correct suggestions for improvement. And so what I want to speak about then, in keeping with that tradition of talking about the thing that keeps one interested, is counterterrorism, and in particular the difficult relationship between counterterrorism and constitutionalism. I was 20 when the attacks of 9/11 took place, and I was working at the time in a solicitor's office on a summer vacation scheme. I was asked to go and get something signed in the bank, which any of us who were law students who worked in a solicitor's office in the summer knows is second only to photocopying in the tasks that one undertakes. And when I arrived in the bank, I found 12 or 15 people gathered around the television screens, watching in a kind of appalled, shocked silence as the second plane flew into the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, in a way that astonishes me now, that it was a terrible, awful coincidence for there to have been 2 such accidents in the same place on the same morning. It simply didn't occur to me that this could have been an act of terrorism. I think it's sobering to think of that just almost 12 years later, that there was a time not so long ago when terrorism wasn't the first thing we thought about when a non-natural disaster of some kind took place. Of course, now we have gone almost to the opposite extreme. We have a tendency to see terrorism everywhere and to see terrorists everywhere. And although that's not precisely what I want to talk about this evening, it is an important foreshadowing to my topic of counterterrorism everywhere, because it helps to explain, at least in part, some of the politico-legal terrain on which I've argued that the counter-terrorist infrastructure has been built. And that infrastructure is immense. It is global, regional, national and local. It is public and private and hybrid, visible and invisible. It is everywhere. And in this lecture, I want to demonstrate that the pervasiveness of counterterrorism, which I will talk about across the axes of the national to the supranational, the public to the private, and legal and extra-legal, that this demonstrates what is essentially my core concern this evening, the incursion of counterterrorism into the lives of all of us, sometimes in underappreciated ways. First, of course, there is the burning question: what is counterterrorism anyway? As with most things that are interesting and vital in this life, the answer is nowhere near as straightforward as the simplicity of the question might suggest, particularly since, in the first place, it arguably requires us to think about what terrorism is, and that's why What is Terrorism is the first chapter in most PhDs on terrorism, the first footnote in most books. I don't want to be passé by going through what terrorism is here this evening, and indeed in my work I've taken the approach that in considering the scope of counterterrorism and the constitutionalist conundrums that it raises, it is not necessary to deeply interrogate the concept of terrorism per se. Now, this is not only to save you all the tedium of a long examination, but because if we approach the concept of terrorism in an overly bounded way, in a manner that is too finely constrained by legislative or other definitions, then we run the risk, I think, of missing quite a lot of the counterterrorism that happens around us. And so it's enough to say, for the purposes of this evening, that terrorism encompasses a broad range of activities done by non-state actors, although some argue that state action should be included, from what we might call traditional terrorism by organised groups using complex and well-organised meta events or attacks, to more individualistic and quite autonomous acts targeting state and civilian targets at large and small scales. Typically, now we think about suicide bombing, cyber attacks, and so-called bedroom or just do it terrorism. If this appears to be unbearably vague, then I'm afraid it simply reflects how counterterrorism itself is conceived, because states, which are the most significant drivers of counterterrorism law and policy, take a remarkably broad approach to what counterterrorism is. So we can take, for example, this definition from the United States Center for Counterterrorism, National Counterterrorism Center, I should say, which states, in what I'm sure we can all agree are remarkably obtuse terms, that the Centre will lead our nation's effort to combat terrorism at home and abroad by analysing the threat, sharing information with our partners, and integrating all instruments of national power to ensure unity of effort. Crystal clear. The broad nature of this mission indicates the fact that within their counterterrorism portfolios, states include a very wide range of activities, such as spying, targeted killing, preventative detention, interrogation, sentiment analysis, infiltration, financial disruption, cyber warfare, internet surveillance, banking regulation, policing, aviation security, border control, deportation, economic aid, regime change, and constitution building. Don't worry, I'm not going to speak about all of them. Broadly speaking, these all fall into the 4 categories of counter-terrorist activity that are named in the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Those being measures to address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, measures to prevent and combat terrorism, measures to build states' capacity to prevent and combat terrorism, and measures to ensure respect for human rights for all and the rule of law as the fundamental basis of the fight against terrorism. And so at both the national and the supranational levels, terrorism is broadly construed indeed. And it is the breadth of this construction that is the first step in recognizing the pervasiveness of counterterrorism, because it includes but is far wider than the high-profile news-making activities of detention and assassination and all too rarely trial. These kinds of activities certainly are the visible tip of a very deep iceberg. In fact, they're so high profile that we run the risk of being blinded by them to a large amount of lower level counterterrorism that goes on a constant basis. Indeed, I was arguably guilty of that myself in the first tranche of my work on counterterrorism, where I focused primarily on internment. While detention deserves, and indeed has received, plenty of attention, it is only a very small part of the counter-terrorist story. It's on the rest of that story now that my work primarily focuses and that I want to speak about this evening. In that work, I want to claim that by sketching the true breadth of counter-terrorist activity, we discover the particular shape of the contemporary security state. A shape that is characterized, I argue, by the delegation of power from the national to the supranational, from the public to the private, and by a worrying embrace of the extra-legal. These patterns mean, I think, that state counter-terrorist power is exercised against us through pathways we're not accustomed to the state acting in, and in ways that we don't recognize as the state, thus creating and exposing serious ruptures in our constitutionalist arrangements. So, if we think first about the movement from the national to the supranational, although states and peoples have always been transnationally connected, we've arguably never been quite so connected across physical, political, economic, familial, and technological dimensions as we are now. This globalized world that we live in means that some challenges confront us as supranational collections of states and peoples rather than as individual states, and one of those is transnational terrorism. Although I don't think it's true that so-called new terrorism is fundamentally different to so-called old terrorism, there is a host of factors that go into globalization, like technology, ease of travel, and ease of cultural migration, that make transnationalism a different challenge for states. It's also the case, and more pertinently so in my view, that the contemporary transnationalism of states and their connections to one another in more formal and institutionalized ways has transformed their management of terrorism, so that we approach it as a collection of states as well as individual states. We do this, I think, through both default and formal delegation. Delegation by default occurred primarily, in my view, through the passage of Resolution 1373 very soon after the attacks of 9/11. By that resolution, the UN Security Council required all states to criminalize certain activities that came under the rubric of terrorism in a way that was really unprecedented, because through this resolution, the Security Council assumed a kind of legislative power that was a de facto delegation by default. This is because the resolution was formally legally binding on all member states of the United Nations, and so where it didn't exist, counter-terrorist legislation was required, and where it did, sometimes it was to be amended. And as Kent Roach has demonstrated in the 9/11 effect, the mechanisms, elements, and operation of those domestic enactments sometimes involved a substantial level of norm borrowing and migration from one state to another that produced significant convergence. Indeed, such convergence might itself be a kind of delegation by default, with states passing but not really autonomously formulating counter-terrorist laws and policies, A, because they're required to, and B, as virtual facsimiles of the laws and policies of their peers. Here in the EU, we have had a more formal delegation to the supranational in the field of counterterrorism. Although EU member states didn't have to give effect to 1373 en masse, they decided early on that that is how they would do so, and they introduced a number of controversial measures as a result, including, very famously, the asset freezing measures that continue to be challenged in the CADI litigation, now in its third iteration before the Court of Justice. CADI and the asset freezing measures have received a lot of attention in the literature, with some optimistic scholars like myself and Suzanne Kingston arguing that the court's approach in CADI was a rights-affirming constitutionalist one, sending a positive message both to member states and to the UN Security Council. However, whether that reading is right or not, and opinion remains divided, the point is that cases like CADI again relate to that visible tip of the iceberg, to measures that we do not necessarily perceive as affecting us at all or in any way, or as possibly affecting us. However, the delegation of power to the supranational in the EU does affect us. If you flew here for this lecture or any other reason, your data, passenger data, will have been transferred under EU-led agreements. If you used a debit or credit card at any time, your transaction will have been tracked and logged and possibly be made available if requested to intelligence and security services. In a preliminary audit of EU counter-terrorism measures done for the purposes of a project called Cecile, which is a project that I lead here in Durham with partners from across Europe, we found more than 100 counter-terrorist measures introduced by the EU since 9/11. The EU's strategy, which in vague terms is to protect, prevent, pursue and respond, was complemented by a detailed action plan that made it quite clear how diverse the areas in which the EU would do counter-terrorism were. So EU counter-terrorism includes things like promoting community policing, criminalising the incitement of terrorism, enhancing supply chain security, simplifying information exchange, securing transportation, and I can't really complain about this one, funding security research. I could go on for some time because there are so many nodes of counter-terrorist activity led by the EU that it's almost beyond our comprehension. As part of Cecile, we will be building a major interactive database to trace and log all of those measures, converting years of work by one of our NGO partners, Statewatch, in compiling the measures into an interactive open source database that all citizens and researchers can use. But so immense is the EU's counterterrorism infrastructure that the mere task of building and populating that database will take a team of full-time researchers working almost only on that the best part of half a year to complete. And there's no end in sight. Just last week in Luxembourg, the EU's Justice and Home Affairs Council met and approved a new package of measures proposed by the counterterrorism coordinator, called for the EU's strategy for combating radicalisation and recruitment to be updated, and reaffirmed, should it have been in doubt, that counterterrorism remains a key concern for the EU. I've forgotten to change my slide. Sorry, the EU is the middle bit. Quite beyond this regionalism, there is a further degree of supranational counterterrorism that deserves attention, and that is our amenability to the counterterrorism of other states. If we write to, email or call somebody who is considered to be suspect in another country, that may well bring us to the attention of the other state's security or intelligence community in a way that we don't anticipate or realise. Similarly, if we engage in online debate or Facebook frequently about terrorism and counterterrorism, another state can become interested in us and extend its long counterterrorist arm into our personal domain. States' extensive intelligence and information sharing make us entirely amenable to such transnational actions. And this is not any kind of conspiracy theory. It's happening right now. We know, for example, that just last year, President Obama promulgated Presidential Policy Directive 20 to use targeted cyber attacks against people and entities outside of the US as a means of counterterrorism. In truth, it's unlikely that this would be used for targeting my counterterrorism-laden Facebook page. It's more likely to be used in the form of things like the Stuxnet attack launched on the Iranian uranium enrichment infrastructure last year. But the fact is that whether or if or when these measures are used against individuals is something we simply cannot know. And we do know that less targeted dragnet approaches to gathering information that affect us outside of the US are and have long been in operation. The revelation last week of the National Security Agency's surveillance programme codenamed Prism and its engagement here in the UK with the government communications headquarters should bring that home quite closely to us. I will turn to talk about Prism in some more detail in a little while, but first of all I want to think more broadly about the shift from the public to the private in counterterrorism. The sharing of information, capacities and expertise between private companies and states in the pursuit of counterterrorism brings me to a delegation of power from state to non-state actors that we might broadly describe as privatization. And this is what I've been paying significant attention to in my more recent work. In my analysis, this privatization, which I use in the full knowledge that it's problematic, but just in a simple form for the sake of this lecture, takes 4 forms. The first is open privatization. In other words, outsourcing done by means of publicly known contracts that can be scrutinized and questioned and so on. The second is closed privatization, which is outsourcing grounded in closed contracts, either the existence or the content of which, or often both, of course, we are not aware of, so that they are not disclosed or subject to any kind of public critique. Thirdly, statutory privatization, where legislative obligations are placed on non-state actors to do some quite specific and precise things within counter-terrorist activity that the state does not want to or perhaps have the capacity to do. And fourthly, what I call non-contractual co-option, where non-state actors are co-opted into counter-terrorism in an informal, networked way without any clear outline of the parameters or even knowledge of the fact of that cooperation being broadly known. These different kinds of privatization are not abstractions, as a few short examples will illustrate. The contractual engagement of private military companies in on-the-ground counterterrorism, and of companies like G4S in the provision of so-called secure solutions to physical intelligence gathering, including the Pentagon and more than a dozen airports here in the UK, are all examples of open privatization in counterterrorism. Of course, we know less by its very nature about closed privatization. It is highly secretive and covert. But we do know through a number of leaks that the United States Extraordinary Rendition Program was reliant on the provision of logistics, aviation and security services by non-state actors. Those contracts are closed because every time somebody tries to access them, their existence is denied. And when people attempt litigation to force their disclosure, the United States government uses a very powerful instrument in law called the state secrets privilege to compel states not to allow disclosure or discovery. Statutory privatization is also widespread in counterterrorism, and states seem to be increasingly interested in extending it. So take, for example, the recent, thankfully unsuccessful attempt in Canada to require all telecommunications service providers to install real-time internet communication intercept equipment in the proposed Protecting Children from Internet Predators Act. This bill, originally called the Lawful Access Act and only mentioning children in its title with pretty much nothing to do with protecting children whatsoever, would have made it mandatory for telecommunications providers to track people's activity in real time, to hand that over to the state when requested, and to answer no if a customer ever asked whether their data had been so handed over. In the end, it was defeated by a huge public outcry, by activism by the online community and NGOs, and indeed by telecommunication service providers themselves, who were concerned about the excessive costs of compliance. Now, people are looking and sounding shocked, but this is not something that is so far from home for us here in the UK, with the so-called Snoopers Charter, more properly called the Communications Data Bill, firmly back on the agenda and supported heavily by the Home Secretary in the light of the Woolwich murder. However problematic contractual and statutory privatisation may be, and I believe that they are very problematic indeed, it's important to note that there is what seems to be an astonishing amount of non-contractual co-option of the private sector in counter-terrorism. This is extremely opaque and difficult to get a full picture of, but we do know that it's heavily used in the context of counter-radicalisation online, so trying to control the internet or the use of the internet in this way. In this context, rather than use statutory instruments or court orders, which are burdensome and time-consuming and often expensive, it is not at all unusual for the state to simply ask a private company to lend a hand, take something down or something like that, and for the company to agree to do so. Attempts to find out more through freedom of information are routinely frustrated, as you can imagine, by the information not being released. So where there is a thread on an internet forum, for example, that seems to advocate so-called Nike terrorism, the just do it sort of form of terrorism, service providers might be made aware of it by the state and asked to remove it, and indeed actually remove it, without any cumbersome court order being required to force them to do so. Similarly, search engines might be, and frequently are, asked to filter content so it doesn't appear in search results, and to adjust their algorithms so that some things are super weighted and go further down in the results. It's interesting, although admittedly perhaps unwise, to experiment with this. So I can't resist. In Dublin last weekend, if you Googled the term Semtex, the first result was the Wikipedia page explaining what Semtex is. Then the next 5 or 6 pages were results about a DJ, a nutritional supplement, a company, a kickboxer, and a video game, all of which inexplicably are called Semtex, or have the word Semtex in their names. It took quite a while to get to more detailed results about Semtex, the explosive, and even longer to find out how to use it. The same was true when I Googled Semtex here in Durham, with the added gem that apparently Katie Price blasts liar Jodie Marsh for her Semtex slimming pills. I think we can all agree that this is unlikely to be because more people who search the term Semtex are interested in Semtex the fat burner, or what Jordan thinks of Jodie Marsh, than are interested in finding out something about Semtex the explosive. Now, I acknowledge that these kinds of non-contractual co-options might not seem to be a matter of extreme concern. You might not feel particularly oppressed by the fact that companies engage in cooperation with the state like this. You might even think it's quite a good idea. But I do think it's important that we know about it, because it is the state acting upon us through a conduit in a way that we don't necessarily appreciate as state power. Of course, counterterrorism is not the only context in which this kind of non-contractual co-option takes place online. It's particularly used in the context of trying to control more extreme forms of pornography and child pornography. But internet filtering, the removal of material, and the adjustment of algorithms in search engines do and should raise legitimacy concerns. Because from a legitimacy perspective, we must remember that this is in fact the state controlling the information we can access and how we access it, without us necessarily even knowing it. Of course, there are also potential privacy violations arising from both the voluntary and the coerced handing over of unusual searching and internet patterns and metadata by companies who hand these over to states, often without our knowledge. And of course, this brings me to Prism, last week, in what for me was astonishingly good timing, The Guardian and The Washington Post broke the story that the US National Security Agency has, since 2007, been running a very significant covert data gathering and surveillance operation called Prism. Through this operation, it appears the US gains access to the servers of United States-based companies, including ones we probably all use every day: Google, Yahoo, Facebook, YouTube, Skype, and Apple. The leaked documents suggest that the NSA gathers information through this, which includes email, the video and voice content of chat, photos, stored data, and logins. And they can also ask for the petrifyingly vague termed special requests from the companies. Here, the information appears in many cases to be more than mere metadata. Metadata is primarily acquired through the secret court orders that we see telecommunications companies being compelled to comply with. So recently, we also had a leak that showed that a court in the US called the FISA court, which is a closed security court, granted an order that compelled Verizon to hand over 3 months' worth of data for their more than 99 million customers in the United States, very shortly after the Boston bombings. In Prism and through these metadata mechanisms, it seems that the data gathered can include real and meta content, but we don't know exactly how it works. We do know that the data is categorized by a program that appears to be called Boundless Informant. This powerful program processes vast amounts of data. So we know from a number of leaks that in March it processed 3 billion pieces of data from the US and a quite astonishing 100 billion pieces of data from outside of the United States. The data, it seems, is then categorized to create what are known as heat maps, indicating where the bulk of more targeted surveillance activity ought to go. And so Prism and its associated programs are immense in their scale and in their scope and effect. They're, of course, applicable to all of us as well. And Prism relies on non-contractual co-option. Even though Facebook and Google appear to be insisting that they didn't know about Prism, the leaked files, and there's one of the slides here from the leaked file, indicates that actually a huge number of companies, including, you see there, Google on the 14th of January 2009 and Facebook on the 3rd of June 2009, agreed voluntarily to cooperate with Prism. That's the implication, at least. Interestingly, Twitter appears to have stood firm against it. Of course, this voluntary or non-contractual co-option is one of the reasons why Prism is so efficient, a mere $20 million a year to run this program. It's a absolute drop in the ocean as security budgets go. It is extremely broad. It engages effectively with intelligence agencies in other countries by making information available to them. In all likelihood, it's entirely legal under US law, and it applies with full force to all of us outside of the United States. Another form of privatization that we might give some attention to is the difficult relationship between industry and states in the context of security-oriented technological innovation. Increasingly, we see new technologies being developed that make counterterrorism more efficient, but also more widespread. And it's not entirely clear what the relationship between industry innovation and security need is. It's not clear which one drives which. But the technological element to counterterrorism is something that we encounter all the time. So many of you fly relatively frequently. If you've come through Heathrow Airport recently, you're likely to have gone through one of these UK BA automated e-passport gates that are on the left here. These automatic passport controls, according to the brochures, which you can access online, are about giving travellers an enjoyable passenger experience. And they were developed in conjunction with what Accenture calls its extensive team of more than 1,000 professionals dedicated to border management and public safety, including biometric technology specialists. These same teams have also been involved in the operation and implementation of US Visit, which is the world's largest biometric system. Of course, frequent flyers are not usually averse to anything that makes our lives a little bit easier, right? Makes it a bit quicker to go through the airport. But these systems don't only do that, they verify the passport but also the passenger through biometric information gathering, with the information being sent through to border control systems and put through real-time checks, so that within 20 seconds, all going well, of putting your passport in, the arrow has turned green, gates have opened, you're in, you're cleared, you're checked, and you're logged, with the data being subject, of course, to intelligence operations possibly in the future. Now, these gates are just a small part of what's known as intelligence-led border control, and Accenture is just one example of a company engaging with the development of these technologies. But it is an interesting example. This one company now works not just with UKBA, but also with the US Homeland Security, so that's the US Visit we spoke about, the European Commission, for which they developed a Europe-wide biometric system in conjunction with the company Sagem Sécurité, and the International Air Transport Association. And even that intelligence-led border control is a really drop in the ocean, a tiny example. Counter-terrorism is seriously big business, as reflected in the fact that every year there is a counter-terror expo. You see the ad here for this year's version in London, where hundreds of companies exhibit their technologies to the attendees. But sadly, we can't go because attendance is limited to government, armed forces, police, defence ministries, media, and trade. This year, more than 400 so-called solutions providers exhibited there, selling everything from drones to armoured vehicles to CCTV cameras, and it's thought that millions and millions of dollars of business would have been done. Now, as counterterrorism is big business, the relationship between industrial innovation and security need is almost inevitably murky, made more murky by the fact that many security innovation companies, particularly in the US, have an extremely good record of hiring in people with high-level security clearance from government, who then become their interlocutors with buyers from various branches of the state, so that it becomes even more difficult to tell whether innovation is responding or driving perceived security need. And even though it's difficult to know the answer to that relationship, it strikes me that the question really matters, because increasingly new technologies like smaller and smaller drones, and yes, that is a drone that's smaller than a quarter, are being developed and sold to government and to individuals. And as they become smaller and cheaper, they begin to be used on a more widespread basis, both for counterterrorism and for other reasons. And so, as industrial innovation makes drones smaller and more affordable, they become more intrusive, and they undermine further our capacity to lead private, non-suspect, autonomous lives. At the same time as this ratcheting up of counter-terrorist technology is taking place by this odd combination of industry and state, practice is outstripping law, and the vista of extra-legality is opening ever wider. At both the national and the supranational level, counterterrorism is executed both through and in spite of law. As lawyers, I guess we're comfortable with legal instruments, even if an offence introduced by statute is repressive or otherwise seems unacceptable. Where we have a piece of law, we feel like we know what to do with it. We can parse it and analyse it, challenge it, try to have it amended or even repealed. What is more challenging, though, is when counter-terrorism is executed extra-legally. Now, extra-legality is one of those almost euphemistic terms sometimes used to indicate illegality. And I don't want here to go into a detailed parsing of the concept or the difference between it and illegality per se. It's enough for our purposes to say that, broadly speaking, to do something extra-legally would mean to do something without lawful authority. A quite remarkable element of contemporary counterterrorism is states' willingness to act without clear lawful authority, in contravention often of both domestic and international standards. This encompasses both extreme illegality and what might appear at first to be smaller scale or less problematic forms of illegality. Although the distinction between the extremely illegal or extra-legal and the merely illegal is important in some ways, it is understandable that we would be especially exercised, for example, by torture, because it is something that within legal culture is simply legally unimaginable. It strikes me that what ought to be of the first degree of concern is not the gravity of the legal wrong, but rather the breadth of the extra legality. The fact that acting outside of the law has become, over the past 12 years, almost banal. Of course, states don't often openly say that they're acting without lawful authority. Instead, they construct arguments to try to convince us that their actions are legally permissible, or they agitate to have them deemed legal, to have our understandings of what is acceptable shifted by reference to nebulous notions of necessity, risk, and security that are almost impossibly difficult to pin down in a meaningful way. They pass domestic laws that seem to run contrary to accepted international legal principles of a limited state and protected rights in a kind of posturing that almost defies us to challenge them. They engage, in other words, in what has become known as lawfare. One might interpret this as respect for the law, as a kind of meaningful engagement in some kind of transformative enterprise that shows a commitment to legality. But such an interpretation, in my estimation, would be overly charitable. I fail to see what is constitutionalist about an engagement with law that is oriented almost entirely towards what I characterized in 2008 as the downward calibration of rights. It is important to acknowledge, of course, that the fact that security states haven't simply abandoned law does say something positive about law's normative resilience. But I don't think this can or should blind us to the fact that this kind of engagement with law is fundamentally counter-constitutionalist. As a result, it should be of real concern, because it means not only that those higher norms that protect bad people from extreme state power are vulnerable, but that all rights-protecting norms are. Here in the UK, privacy rights, respect for the home and bodily integrity, the right to legal representation, the right to answer the case against you, and the principle of open justice are all under threat as a result of so-called security needs. And so erosions in these norms are happening right now, and they seem to me to be the end point of the decision to do whatever is considered necessary and somehow to make whatever was necessary seem legal. This pattern in counterterrorism shifts the legal imagination and, in my view, changes politico-legal culture. It is a strange kind of constitutionalism that says we are bound by legal principles only in as much as we want to be, and that the content of those principles is infinitely negotiable, that everything is up for grabs. And yet, it seems that this is the kind of constitutionalism we are moving towards now. And so, if counterterrorism is everywhere, as I think it is, and if it is infecting and distorting our views of what law is for, what does that mean for us as individuals going about our everyday lives, as citizens and as rights bearers? The vision of our relationship to power, upon which the architecture of accountability and human rights is now constructed, sees us as surrounded by the state, which is the source of power that law is concerned with, primarily, which is in turn subject to at least some international controls, including international human rights law. But in this picture, the state is relatively simple, and the international sphere is a source of exogenous rights-affirming control. But the patterns of counterterrorism over the past 12 years that I've tried to illustrate, at least in part this evening, suggest in contrast that the security state is disaggregated, and that the international sphere itself, at least partially acts as a conduit for counterterrorism, even when international human rights law is trying to be robust. If in its provision of security and the related imposition of security measures, the state has become fragmented, disaggregated to the point of being a regulatory security state, to adjust a phrase from Colin Scott, and if the international sphere is now a security actor in a way that touches intimately on our everyday lives, this raises questions about the fitness and capacity of traditional human rights techniques, and particularly human rights law, to maintain constitutionalism. The challenges are manifold. First, there is a simple political challenge to using human rights in an atmosphere that sees them as obstacles to security and engages heavily in efforts to undermine or circumvent them. Then there are more structural challenges with trying to apply human rights standards to companies, for example, who of course are not states, not signatories to international human rights treaties, and often not subject to domestic constitutional limits. Fundamentally, then, there are legal, doctrinal, and cultural challenges to effectively asserting rights in a security context. And so our first thought might be to use courts to try to assert rights. But even though courts are being less deferential in contemporary security-related cases than they were in the past, they are still limited in what they can do. These limits are both institutional and emanating from government behaviour, which sees the assertion, such as the assertion of privilege and state secrets to prevent judges considering highly sensitive matters, and the introduction of statutory measures to prevent courts from hearing cases at all, so-called jurisdiction stripping measures, or from issuing transparency-oriented orders, such as the now gutted Norwich Pharmacal order in the security context here in the UK. However, the greatest obstacle to using courts as an effective means of asserting rights in counter-terrorism may well be politics itself, which over recent years in the UK and the US has taken a minimal and certainly counter-constitutionalist approach to implementing rights-enforcing decisions from superior courts. And so if courts are limited and politics as it stands is unsatisfactory, how can we maintain constitutionalism, if indeed that is what we want to do? Building from the core belief that transparency and accountability are vital to this enterprise, I argued that we must be innovative in our approaches to trying to achieve these objectives, and to deploy those innovations in conjunction with legal techniques such as litigation and rights-based review. Much, I'm sure, to the amusement of my good friend and co-author Fergal Davis, who's been preaching to me about the constitutional potential of politics to no avail for many years, I have come to realise that this will require popular agitation and imagination to force a realignment of political perspective. Since 2001, there has been plenty of political gain to be made from introducing and supporting measures that enhance or appear to enhance security, largely, in my view, for two reasons. The first is that people genuinely want more security and are unwilling to accept terrorism is a risk that cannot be legislated out of existence. This is in spite of the fact that we cannot eradicate terrorism. All we can do is manage it. And if we try and want to live in some kind of equitable, constitutionalist and plural society while managing terrorism, we must be prepared to accept that the risk will always be there. Our refusal to accept this greases the way for the kind of counter-constitutionalist engagement with law, with its concept, content and bindingness that I discussed earlier on. The second reason is that perhaps we have not fully realised how significantly we have invited and empowered the state to turn us into suspect individuals, into those who must be subjected to counter-terrorism. Rather than see the counter-terrorism all around us, we have seen it over there and done to them. We have convinced ourselves that if we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear, and simply failed to realise that we are all potential terrorists now, that as people simply going about our daily business, we are acted upon as if we were guilty. We live in a highly suspicious state and suprastate, intruded upon. We are all other, and there is in essence, little to protect us from the counter-terrorist attentions of our state or any other state. It is surely one of the paradoxes of contemporary counter-terrorism that it has been constructed on the concept of a dangerous, febrile, radicalized, uncontrollable other, so that we have endorsed, if not demanded, repressive measures, assuming them to apply only to that other, when in fact they apply to us all. When we see the true shape and extent of the contemporary security state and see counter-terrorism everywhere, we will, I hope, begin to both agitate for a more restrained state as regards us, and develop a heightened empathy with the ultra-suspect other. Translating that empathy into a dialing back of counter-terrorism is very challenging, and it requires us, as I said, to be innovative. As well as trying to litigate and develop legal doctrinal rationales for effectively applying human rights standards to counter-terrorism, we must find ways of embracing non-legal instruments and movements to create momentum around change. Political codes of conduct, ethical investment, shareholder and consumer activism, whistleblowing, leaking, and what I've elsewhere called wiki-countability are all potential pathways, along with legal doctrinal change and judicial engagement, towards the increased accountability and decreased counter-terrorism of the state and superstate. The shape of the modern counter-terrorist state, as I have presented it here this evening, is such that relying completely on our traditional modes of accountability is simply insufficient. We need to do more, but the precise content of that more is a matter for another lecture.